The night my husband told me he didn't love me anymore, he was wearing the tie I had picked out for him that morning. I had ironed his shirt, made his coffee, packed his lunch, and somewhere between breakfast and dinner, he had decided I was no longer enough. But the moment that broke me completely wasn't when he asked for a divorce. It was when I found out she was already sleeping in my bed, wearing my robe, while I was still legally his wife. What he didn't know was that I had spent 23 years quietly building something he never paid attention to. And when the truth finally came out, he didn't call his lawyer. He called me, sobbing. My name is Carol Hastings. I'm 54 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. And what I'm about to tell you is the story of how the man I gave everything to handed me the greatest gift of my life, by leaving. Before I begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. And if you love emotional stories with real justice at the end, please like this video, hit subscribe and ring that bell. You will not want to miss how this ends. Daniel and I met when I was 29 years old at a mutual friend's barbecue in the summer of 2000. He was charming in that quiet, confident way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. He had dark hair, a slow smile, and he listened, really listened, when I talked. I thought I had found something rare. I thought I had found a man who saw me. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. Nothing fancy. Just family, close friends, paper lanterns strung between the oak trees, and a chocolate cake my mother baked herself. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings. Daniel cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. I remember thinking that I would never forget that look on his face for as long as I lived. I was right, I never forgot it, but eventually I understood it differently. For the first several years things were good, not perfect, nothing ever is, but genuinely good. We bought a modest house on Clover Street. I worked as a medical billing specialist for a large hospital network, and Daniel built his career in commercial real estate. We didn't have children by choice, something we had agreed on early and revisited often enough to confirm. Our life was ours, quiet, stable, and built brick by brick with both our hands. But somewhere around year 15, something shifted. And I don't mean suddenly. I mean the slow, almost invisible kind of shift that you don't notice until you look back and realize you've been standing in the wrong room for years. Daniel started working later, traveling more. His phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter, started going everywhere with him, including the bathroom. He stopped asking about my day, stopped reaching for my hand during movies. Our conversations became logistical. Schedules, bills, grocery lists. We were roommates with a shared last name. I told myself it was stress. Career pressure. Middle age. I made excuses the way women who love too hard always do, crafting reasons to explain away the distance because the alternative was too devastating to consider. I want to be clear about that. I suggested counseling twice. The first time Daniel said we didn't need it. The second time he laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively, the way you laugh at something too small to take seriously. That laugh sat in my chest for weeks. Then came the January that changed everything. Daniel had been on a so-called work trip to Atlanta for 4 days. I hadn't thought much of it. He traveled regularly, and I had long since stopped asking detailed questions because the answers were always vague and always the same. But this time, something felt different when he came home. He was lighter somehow, looser, like a man who had just exhaled after holding his breath for a very long time. He was happy in a way that had nothing to do with me. I didn't say anything that night. I watched him move around the kitchen, pour himself a glass of wine, scroll through his phone with a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. I watched him the way you watch a stranger on a train, curious, detached, unsettled. 2 weeks later, I found the hotel receipt. It had fallen behind the dresser, just slipped down into that narrow space between the furniture and the wall. I only found it because I was looking for an earring I'd dropped. I almost didn't pick it up, but I did, and when I read it, the room tilted. The reservation was for 2 people. The room was upgraded to a suite, and there were charges, spa treatments, room service, champagne. A long romantic weekend documented in black and white on a flimsy piece of thermal paper. Her name wasn't on the receipt, but she didn't need to be. I stood in that bedroom for a long time. Just stood there, holding that small piece of paper like it weighed 1,000 pounds, listening to the refrigerator hum downstairs and the birds outside and every ordinary sound of the life I thought I had. Then I folded it carefully, put it in my coat pocket, and went downstairs to make dinner. I didn't confront him. Not yet, because something deep and quiet inside me said, wait, learn everything first. I hired a private investigator 3 days later. A woman named Deborah, recommended by a colleague. She was professional, thorough, and completely without judgment. Within 2 weeks, she handed me a folder that I had to sit down to open. Her name was Tiffany Morrow. She was 31 years old. She worked at a marketing firm that had contracted with Daniel's company 18 months earlier. She was blonde, pretty in a polished way, and according to her social media, which Deborah had printed in careful detail, she had a lifestyle that did not match a junior marketing associate's salary. Daniel had been paying for it. There were credit card statements Deborah had legally obtained through the discovery process we had quietly begun. Dinners, jewelry, a weekend in Charleston, another in New York. There was a lease, an apartment in a newer building on the north side of the city. A lease co-signed by my husband. She was living in an apartment my husband was paying for, while I was ironing his shirts. I sat with that information for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of cooking dinner and asking how his day was and lying in bed next to him in the dark, completely still, while my entire world quietly rebuilt itself around a new and terrible truth. Then I called my attorney. Her name was Patricia Owens, and she came highly recommended by a friend who had gone through a difficult divorce 5 years earlier. Patricia was sharp, calm, and absolutely relentless when she needed to be. Within our first meeting, she asked me one question that reoriented everything. "Carol," she said, setting down her pen and looking at me directly, "do you know exactly what you own?" And I thought I did, but I quickly learned that what I thought I owned and what I legally and strategically owned were two very different things. You see, over the years, I had done something that seemed small at the time but turned out to be enormously significant. Because I handled our household finances, Daniel was never interested in the details. I had kept meticulous records. Every account, every asset, every property document. And more importantly, I had inherited a significant sum from my Uncle Robert 7 years earlier. A sum I had kept, on Patricia's predecessor's advice from a separate estate matter, in an account entirely in my name. Daniel had never asked about it, he didn't even know the full amount. Patricia reviewed everything I brought her over 2 long meetings. Then she looked up from the documents and said something I will never forget. "He picked the wrong woman to underestimate." We began building our case carefully and quietly. I was not going to be the wife who got blindsided. I was going to be the one holding every card when the table finally flipped. But before I could control the timing, Daniel forced my hand. It was a Thursday evening in late March. I had just gotten home from work and was still in my coat when he came into the kitchen with that expression, tight around the eyes, rehearsed around the mouth, and I knew before he opened his mouth what was coming. He said he hadn't been happy for a long time. He said he cared about me but wasn't in love with me anymore. He said he thought we had grown apart. Every line was smooth and practiced, like he had run them in his head 100 times. Maybe he had. Maybe he'd been rehearsing in that apartment he was paying for on the north side of town. He didn't mention Tiffany. He presented it as a mutual evolution, a natural ending. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said very calmly, "Okay, Daniel, if that's what you want, let's do this the right way." He looked almost relieved. I think he expected tears. A scene. Begging, maybe. He had no idea that I had already spoken to an attorney, already begun documentation, already understood exactly what I was entitled to. He smiled, actually smiled, and said he was glad we could be adults about this. That smile, I tucked it away. The next morning he moved some clothes to what I later confirmed was Tiffany's apartment. He told me he'd stay there temporarily while we sorted things out. He seemed so comfortable with the whole arrangement, so settled. That comfort was about to have a very short shelf life. Patricia filed the divorce petition that same week, citing irreconcilable differences and including documentation of the dissipation of marital assets, the apartment lease, the credit card expenditures, the trips. All of it legally obtained, all of it time-stamped, all of it damning. Daniel's attorney called Patricia 2 days later, apparently in a state of controlled alarm. But that was just the beginning. What neither Daniel nor Tiffany had any idea about, what no one outside of Patricia and my financial advisor knew, was what I had done with my inheritance and 23 years of careful, quiet, unacknowledged financial management. Daniel thought of me as the woman who paid the bills. He never imagined I had been building something. The first hearing was scheduled. The documents were prepared. And then, just before everything was set to be laid out in full, something happened that neither Patricia nor I could have scripted. Tiffany Morrow hired her own attorney. Not for anything related to our divorce. For something else entirely. 3 days after Tiffany hired her attorney, I got a call from Patricia that made me sit down on the kitchen floor. Not because I was devastated. Because I was absolutely stunned by what karma had decided to do entirely on its own, without any help from me at all. Tiffany Morrow was suing Daniel Hastings for fraud, emotional manipulation, and the illegal use of her personal information to secure financial lines of credit she had never authorized. Somewhere between playing the role of devoted boyfriend and convincing her to sign documents she apparently hadn't read carefully enough, Daniel had put her name on things. Debts, accounts, liabilities she didn't know existed until collection calls started arriving at her workplace. The man who had replaced me with a younger woman had apparently decided to use that younger woman too. Patricia said it quietly, professionally, but I could hear something underneath her words, the careful restraint of a woman trying very hard not to say "I told you so" about human nature in general. I sat on that kitchen floor for a while, the same kitchen where I had made his coffee, packed his lunches, ironed his shirts, and I felt something move through me that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief. It was something closer to clarity. The kind that only comes when you finally see a person completely, every angle, every shadow, and understand that you were never the problem. I had spent months wondering what she had that I didn't, what she offered that made 23 years suddenly feel disposable. And sitting there on that cold tile floor, I realized the answer was simply that she was new. That was it. That was the whole of it. Daniel didn't leave me for someone better. He left me for someone who hadn't yet figured out who he really was. She figured it out. The divorce proceedings moved faster after that, partly because Daniel's legal situation had become significantly more complicated, and his attorney was suddenly juggling 2 fires at once. Patricia was methodical and relentless. Every asset was accounted for, every hidden expenditure documented. Every attempt Daniel made to minimize or obscure was met with paperwork that proved otherwise. Daniel hired a second attorney partway through, a more aggressive one, a man named Gerald Fitch who had a reputation for making proceedings ugly. Gerald's first move was to argue that my inheritance should be considered a marital asset, given that some of it had been used, indirectly, marginally, for household expenses over the years. Patricia dismantled that argument in one filing. The account had been kept entirely separate. The documentation was airtight. My Uncle Robert, God rest him, had been very specific in how he structured his estate, and I had followed every legal guideline to the letter from the day the inheritance arrived. Gerald tried 3 more angles. Patricia blocked every one. What Daniel received in the final settlement was a fair division of our genuinely shared marital assets. The house on Clover Street, which we sold, and a portion of the retirement accounts we had both contributed to. What he did not receive was a single dollar of my inheritance, my personal savings, or the investment account I had quietly grown over the previous decade with the help of a financial advisor he had never once asked about. He also received, courtesy of Tiffany's lawsuit, a legal bill that would take years to untangle. I walked out of that courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in October with Patricia beside me, the sun doing something beautiful to the trees lining the street, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Not happy exactly, divorce is never clean, no matter how right it is, but free. Genuinely, solidly free. I bought a condo on the east side of the city 3 weeks later. 2nd floor, tall windows, a small balcony that caught the morning light in a way that made me want to get up early just to sit with my coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. It was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture I chose myself. Every color on the walls my decision. No one's preferences to accommodate but my own. It felt extraordinary. I threw myself back into life with an energy that surprised even me. I had been so focused on surviving the marriage in its final years, managing the distance, explaining away the coldness, making myself smaller so the silence wouldn't echo so loudly, that I had quietly abandoned pieces of myself I didn't even realize were missing. I started painting again. I had loved watercolors in my 20s and had set them aside somewhere around year 8 of the marriage because there never seemed to be time or space or a reason that felt important enough. I set up a small table on the balcony and painted on weekend mornings and discovered that I was still good at it. Better, maybe, because I was painting without apology now. I joined a hiking group through a community center near the condo. 12 women, most of them in their 40s and 50s, every one of them funny and sharp and uninterested in being small. We hiked every other Saturday regardless of weather. We talked about everything. We laughed loudly. I came home from those mornings feeling like someone had opened a window inside my chest. I also received a promotion at work that spring, a senior director position I had been quietly building toward for several years. My manager told me during the offer conversation that I was, without question, the most prepared candidate they had ever considered for the role. I accepted with a steadiness that felt earned. Daniel, meanwhile, was navigating a situation that grew more complicated by the month. Tiffany's lawsuit had exposed financial irregularities that attracted additional scrutiny, not just in civil court but from his company's compliance department, which had policies about personal financial conduct that Daniel had apparently not taken seriously enough. He was placed on administrative leave in January. By March, his position had been quietly eliminated. I didn't celebrate that. I want to be honest about that. Watching someone's life unravel, even someone who hurt you deeply, doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like consequence, like watching a long equation finally resolve. But I won't pretend I wasn't human enough to feel something when Patricia forwarded me a copy of a filing from Tiffany's attorney that described, in clear legal language, exactly what Daniel had done. The manipulation, the false promises, the financial exploitation. Everything I had suspected about his character, confirmed in a court document. Tiffany, for what it's worth, won her case. A settlement was reached and Daniel paid significantly. I don't know the exact amount, I didn't need to. The call came on a Tuesday evening in April. I was on my balcony with a glass of wine and a book I had been slowly, pleasurably working through for 2 weeks. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me, and I looked down and saw his name. Daniel. I stared at it through 3 full rings. Then something, curiosity, maybe, or just the quiet confidence of a woman who no longer had anything to fear from this person, made me answer. Carol, his voice was different, smaller, the smooth rehearsed quality completely gone. I didn't know if you'd pick up. I almost didn't, I said, honest. There was a long pause, then he said, I made a terrible mistake. I didn't say anything, I let the silence sit. I lost my job, he said. The lawsuit, everything it all fell apart. Tiffany she's not who I thought she was. I looked out over the balcony at the street below, at the ordinary beautiful Tuesday evening going on without drama or crisis, and I thought about everything I could say to that. Every pointed truth I had stored up over the years. Every quiet devastation he had handed me that he probably didn't even remember. Instead I said, I'm sorry to hear that, Daniel. And I meant it, not deeply, not painfully, but genuinely, because I was no longer someone whose peace depended on his suffering. I was wondering, he started, then stopped, started again. I've been thinking about whether there's any possibility of. No, I said, gently but without hesitation, there isn't. Another long pause. You seem good, he said finally, and there was something almost bewildered in his voice. Like he had expected to find me broken and couldn't quite process that I wasn't. I am good, Daniel, I said, I'm really genuinely good. We said goodbye shortly after. I sat there for a while after hanging up, listening to the evening, feeling the spring air on my face. Then I picked up my book and kept reading. I've thought about that call many times since. About what it meant that he reached out. About what he was hoping I would offer, forgiveness, maybe, or comfort, or some version of the old Carol who made everything easier for everyone else at her own expense. But that Carol had retired. Quietly, without announcement, sometime between hiring Patricia and buying the condo and getting back on that hiking trail, and setting up that little watercolor table on a balcony that belonged entirely to her. The woman who answered that phone had built something real from the wreckage he left behind, and she wasn't about to trade it for the comfort of a man who only called when he had nothing left. My name is Carol Hastings. I'm 54 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. I spent 23 years loving a man who was counting on me never to discover my own worth. He was wrong about that, and I have the life to prove it. If this story moved you, touched something real in you, please give it a like, it means more than you know. Share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over isn't the end. It's sometimes the very best beginning. And subscribe if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and full of justice. And if you have your own story, or know someone with a story like this, share it in the comments. Your story could become our next video.